led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin summoned me boys and kicked them out again. Oh, southern lad, in Georgia he was born. With his fast and fields of waving corn, and Stalin is afar, his fingers there free, planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Welcome back, everybody. It is another episode of Decline and Fall. You join myself and Kit Clarenberg as we chase the tidal wave of news around the beachy head of history and hit the stony beach of reality with a tidal wave of imperial decline. Kit, as somebody who's sitting in a place which stands to benefit enormously from the tidal wave of imperial decline sweeping past it and perhaps sweeping away certainly British elements that have been lingering around the Balkans for about 30 years, how are you feeling today?
I'm thrilled. I must report that there is a widespread buzz among people of both the right and left that I know about Trump coming in and clearing house and the total disarray that this has thrown British but also EU meddling projects within the Balkans. So I mean, I think I think people are amazed at how quickly this has all happened and how substantive it has already been. And this was we remain less than a month into Trump's administration. And what's around the corner could be even more seismic and significant, as we will get into, I'm sure.
Yes, indeed. Now, just before we jump into it, I should just say that, of course, Trump is getting taken to court by various people and involved with the Democrats trying to stop the US aid cuts. But the point about this is that the damage is already done. Even if the court forces Trump to reverse course, even if he gets, found to have violated and overstepped his mark, and that Doge is actually run by, somebody who isn't Elon Musk, what a surprise. The damage is done because what Trump has done, maybe inadvertently, is to pull the mask off, as we have said before, all of these so-called civil society projects and things that are in no way can be described as civil society projects, things a lot worse than that, and revealed that the everything that goes on in places like, well, all of the former Yugoslav republics, Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine, Slovakia, name a country. That none of this is organic at all. This is all bought and paid for by the US. It is the classic neo-colonial model in that the US and the British reduce a country to being essentially a resource slave, a site of resource extraction or exploitation. They destroy all aspects of that society. Then they build them a fake civil society over the top of it, a fake intelligentsia, one that is entirely beholden to them. Trump, by doing what he's done, has inadvertently proved many decades of independent journalism by people like Kit and Marxist scholarly work by people like Samir Amin and others to be completely correct. So it doesn't matter if some judge rules against him. The cat is very much out of the bag and has run into the house and is now shitting all over the worktop. So on that, I'll leave Kit to pick up on that analogy before we move on to our first story. Did you have anything you wanted to throw in on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that some of the most remarkable disclosures about the impact of these aid cuts have come from, to say the least, like interested sources. So in my neck of the woods, we've had Balkan Insight, this CIA and MI6 run propaganda platform, which has basically had to shut off most of its operations, lay off or furlough an enormous amount of staff, make pay cuts of up to 60%. There was an amazing article in Iran International, which is this Saudi-run, very Islamic Republic anti-resistance outlet, where there were a large number of largely nameless civil society activists, quote unquote, including a representative of an organization called Human Rights Activists in Iran, which is based in Virginia, not far from CIA headquarters, like in reality. And they were all saying that, like, even if this pause is temporary, as claimed, all of these programs are screwed. Like they won't be able to replenish themselves. They have been heavily exposed for effectively imperial satrapies, which have no organic financing or support or credibility with average people. And there was in this same Iran International article, there was this amazing passage in which quote unquote internet experts said that big tech is unwilling and unable without US financing to provide apps like Signal and browsers like Tor, both created by the CIA, of course, and other kind of internet freedom tools without US government support, which again cuts to the core of the fact that Silicon Valley, as Yasha Levine wrote very persuasively in Surveillance Valley, is an extension of the US intelligence community, and always has been, and is completely dependent on them for survival. So yeah, I think that there's a large, there are some very rude awakenings currently afoot. I have spoken to people throughout the former Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union, and indeed Yugoslavia, who are absolutely delighted that these meddling operations have ceased, and that they can get on with their lives, and feel that governance is now back in their hands, even if temporarily. So in the spirit of people, average Germans cheering when Trump punitively removed American soldiers from Germany, which was undone by Biden, of course. I think that there's a large number of people who aren't getting quoted in Balkan Insight and Iran International who are like, could this pause just be forever? Like, would that, like, please, like,
Well, I mean, we will get on to the first story in just a second, but I think what it reveals is the fact that anybody who's associated with like programs like this in the future, everybody will know where the orders are coming from. Like, there's no doubt anymore as to what this is. And if that's all the legacy that Trump leaves behind, then he's probably worth putting up a golden statue of. Because he may, as we will now get into, inadvertently end up fundamentally weakening, or I don't know about destroying NATO. I certainly don't think that would be his intention, but he may fracture it by accident. And so we go to the screen. You can see, dear viewers, that we are sharing here now. For those of you who are listening on the audio version of this, all the references that we're making here that are shared will be on show notes that you can find on our Substack page. That we'll be placing those up there as we go along. So if you're following along on the audio version, open up Substack, pull this up, and you can see on there the links to the references that we're using if you want to follow along with that. So with that bit of bureaucratic business taken care of, we will now turn to our first story, Kit, which is that this the recent meeting, February the 12th, which was attended by Pete Hegseth, the Fox News commentator and man who likes a drink before midday, which of us hasn't at some stage, and who has turned up to Brussels and has essentially told the Western Europeans, this is your problem now. And we're going to essentially extract the US from the Ukraine conundrum that they created for themselves. And he has literally handed over to Keir Starmer's government the leadership of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, which is as good a way as any of making sure the whole thing falls to pieces and does nothing. Because, as we will get into later on, the British government and the British Army can't do shit. But anyway, Kit, your response to Hegseth's basically essentially turning up and telling the Europeans that, well, we're not going to do anything. You want to send troops to Ukraine. We're not going to give you any security guarantees. We're going to basically bring this project to an end, and you can do what you like, but you basically better not get in the way. I think is the fair summary there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it is worth, we won't go over everything that he said in detail now. And I would urge our viewers and listeners to check this out for yourself. This was the first of multiple broadsides over the past week. I mean, it's amazing how quickly this has all happened, leading up to the summit between Rubio and Lavrov, which we'll get into in due course. But I mean, I think this was effectively throwing down a gauntlet of sorts, not inviting Europe to fight, but inviting Europe to pack up their toys and go home and resign their fantasies of keeping the war going. He explicitly, Hegseth, he explicitly ruled out Ukraine's membership in NATO. It's not going to be invited to join the alliance. He said that the US is not going to send troops to Ukraine for any reason, including peacekeeping. The US is cutting off its supply of weapons and other forms of support for Ukraine, and it will be up to European NATO members to fill the void if they can, which they can't. Again, we'll get into. And there were hints that Ukraine would need to hold elections, and they also he robustly ruled out any return to pre-2014, let alone 1991 borders for Ukraine, which means that, you know, everything that Ukraine has lost, it is not going to be helped to get back. And this, you know, is in the wake of Trump having a 90-minute conversation with Putin, and then a subsequent 10-minute chat with Zelensky, where Zelensky was probably told, well, you know, these are our terms, and you have no choice but to accept them, or, you know, look elsewhere for support. So, I mean, as I say, this was just the very, very first. It seems that certain elements of the NATO and EU power structure, if you can even call it that at this stage, got the message. Not long after, Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister, he issued a statement saying that Ukraine had never, ever been promised NATO membership, and that was never going to be a component of a negotiated settlement with Russia. Actually, in October last year, Rutte said the exact opposite, and as I think you delved into in your dissection of the completely meaningless and empty 100-year agreement between Britain and Ukraine, Rutte stated that Ukraine's NATO path was irreversible. So this is a direct contradiction of his prior statements. But as I say, other Eurocrats and NATOcrats haven't really appeared to catch up with this. Now, we fast forward a mere day or two later, and then we have the start of the Munich Security Conference, which I think it will go down in history as the most significant meeting of this of this conference since 2007, when Putin gave his now very famous speech about how Russia will refuse to become vassalized like other NATO members, and also ask the obvious question of if NATO is a defensive rather than hostile alliance, why are we cut out of it, and why does it keep pushing up towards our borders? And we will reject this, and will, if we feel threatened, respond to it, which in many ways laid the foundations for where we are today. Now, on the opening day of the Munich Security Conference, JD Vance, who is the vice president, he gave an absolutely blistering speech. Now, whatever your feelings about Donald Trump or JD Vance as people or politicians, or whether you agree with anything that he said or not, this was a very, very, very clear message to Europe that you are no longer a core consideration or interest for us. We are not going to defend you. We're not going to allow you to outsource all your military strength to us entirely. And he also made a number of extremely pointed comments about Europe's slide into tyranny. And he specifically referenced the coup in Romania that transpired at the end of last year, where Calin Georgescu, this outsider politician who was anti-war, anti-sanctions, and explicitly stood on a platform of ending Romania's support for Ukraine, and was on the verge of winning before the court overturned the elections and called for a renewed vote, which will take place in a few weeks' time, I think. But yeah, that he explicitly called out European elites for encouraging this autocratic coup, and he suggested that European leaders need to ask themselves whether they're holding themselves to an appropriately high standard. Of course, the US does not abide by those standards itself, but I mean, in terms of a real, really unambiguous message that the post-World War II, post-Cold War international order is dead and it's not coming back. This was completely unambiguous, and I think, yes, again, it is worth going into reading this in full, because it was really quite extraordinary for a US official to be talking with such, I mean, I would call it like open contempt for at least under Biden, where like it was clear that the US viewed Europe as a bunch of has-beens and lower ranked vassals, but they still referred to our European partners, our allies, blah blah blah. There was none of that here. There was no attempt to finesse it, and he also took aim at moves in Germany to prescribe Alternative for Deutschland, which, according to polls, is going to do very, very, very well in the forthcoming German elections. More on Germany later.
Well, I think what this reveals is two things. One is that, as you say, this is essentially the US ruling class with the mask off, which is that they've always thought that the Europeans were essentially a bunch of cringing grovelers who they had to indulge because of the Cold War, but now they are essentially just going to put them in their place in no uncertain terms, because they know very well that the Europeans won't have nowhere else to go. In theory, the Europeans could increase the amount of trade they do with the Chinese, but they're not going to do that if they wanted to replace the US as a big-time trade partner. The US knows that the Europeans are still going to accept all the American capital that comes through New York into London, into Paris, into Berlin, into the rest of Europe. And they know that the Europeans have nowhere else to go for defense. Also, the other point is that all the crap that was talked by like Kaya Kallas and others about, oh, Putin won't stop at Ukraine, they've always known that was untrue. They've always known that that was a complete lie because, as we'll get into, they haven't done anything, these European countries, to actually address the supposedly dire threat of the evil, Genghis Putin, who is apparently storming westward in under an unstoppable horde of, new unhackable drones or something. They've done nothing. They haven't expanded their defense production barely at all, partly because they can't, mostly though because there's no sense of urgency, because they know that there's no Russian threat. They've always known that. But what they hoped to do was to spin this Ukraine war out in the hope that anything would happen to destabilize Russia and they would be able to get what they wanted that way. So they know that there's no threat. So Vance can turn up and kick them around and they can't do anything because Vance knows and Trump knows and all the European leaders actually know that first of all, they can't go anywhere else for investment or defense. And also, that there is no real Russian threat at all. So what he's done is essentially just kicked over the table and revealed the illusion beneath.
Indeed, indeed, and I think as well that the in advance of the Lavrov Rubio summit, which seems to have been convened without European leaders, including Zelensky, being kept in the loop at all, that this was going ahead. A mixed picture of what was discussed and the success of those talks has emerged. And again, we'll get into this, but I mean, I think that in the lead up to that meeting, Marco Rubio issued a series of questions for Europeans to consider. And again, I don't think that this was seriously outlined as huddle amongst yourselves and provide us with answers. It was effectively a series of rhetorical questions driving home to the Europeans that they have no choice but to fall in line with whatever the US puts in front of them. Okay, so I shall read out, there are 6 questions that were posed, but I shall read out a few of them. What do you view as a Europe-backed security guarantee that would serve as a sufficient deterrent to Russia while also ensuring this conflict ends with an enduring peace settlement? Which European or third countries do you believe could or would participate in such an arrangement? Would your country be willing to deploy its troops to Ukraine as part of a peace settlement? How and where would these forces be deployed and for how long? What actions do US allies and partners need to be prepared to take if Russia attacks these forces? What, if any, US support requirements would your government consider necessary for its participation in these security arrangements? The list goes on. Again, it's worth reading in full. But I mean, I think it's just very, very, outside certain utterly deranged elements within very particular countries who within Europe, who for the most part or / universally have no militaries worthy of the name or ability to act independently of the US. I think yes, this was effectively a set of basically a set of bullet points outlining why European fantasies of keeping this going, let alone constructing some kind of managed peace whereby European soldiers are on Ukrainian territory to prevent outbreaks of further fighting and further Russian advances. If the recipients of these questions were to consider seriously the implications of this set of quote-unquote questions, the answer would be, well, actually, we can't do anything, and we're not going to be able to come up with anything remotely credible or sustainable. Yes. So we are best off just, letting the US and Russia and potentially China hammer out some kind of deal and then just accepting it. I mean, you mentioned Kaya Kallas, who, I mean, the European leaders, and Kaya being among them, have expressed disquiet and anger at not being invited to these talks. Kaya, who is, a former Estonian leader who is descended from Nazi collaborators. She has openly called for the balkanization of Russia. Now, Estonia is, in terms of its size, compared to Russia, is a tiny village. So, I mean, under what terms is Russia going to A, take seriously anything they have to say, or B, be remotely welcoming of their input to a discussion with the US? Like, I mean, why would you think, oh yeah, we've got to include Estonia in this? Like, who's been this rabid chihuahua thorn in our side since 1991. And has played an enormous role in whipping up hysterical anti-Russian, along with Lithuania, I might add, well, the Baltics in general, but like whipping up hysterical Russophobia across Europe for many, many years. And you're going to sit down and have a constructive conversation with this person? No.
Probably not.
Yeah, it's not going to happen, is it?
Well, no. I mean, the Baltics were elevated by George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld on the grounds that they were new Europe, and basically they would be reliable order takers from the US within NATO. When there was the delusion 20 years ago that the French and the Germans were going to try and pilot the European Union in a more strategically independent direction. That ran aground on the basis of the fact that the European Union has always been a US-sponsored creation and can't be anything other than that. And also, to make doubly sure, the US insisted upon the entry of the Baltic states and others who are sort of rabidly pro-US into the EU to make sure it remained as divided, crippled, and useless as possible. Well, job done. Absolutely 100% success rate there. So again, like, why would anybody listen to the rabid ravings of the offspring of Nazi collaborators who, by the way, who were let go by a certain Nikita Khrushchev from the gulag that they deservedly been sent to. And her old man, Kallas Sr., became a very senior official in the Estonian Soviet Republic right up to the end of the Soviet system. So he, in quite a privileged position, as things became more corrupt in the old USSR, the bureaucrats at the very top did start to live like minor bourgeois in some respects. So she's actually benefited for her entire life from being born into the hierarchy of the Soviet system. That's where her family derives their connections, their status, and a good portion of their wealth from, was the fact that her old man conned and scammed his way through the Soviet system to almost to the top of it. And yet she sort of screams and denounces the Soviet Union every single turn. Well, me think the lady doth protest too much on that particular question. Now, Kit, speaking of fading, irrelevant backwaters, possibly run by Nazi collaborators and or paedophiles, can you guess which country we're turning to next?
Is it Britain?
Well, I don't know what gave it away, but here we go. We have an escalating political crisis here, and you could have said that really at any point over the last 20 years. But we have Sir Keir, Jimmy Savile's old friend, who recently appointed, of course, Jeffrey Epstein's old friend, Peter Mandelson, to be ambassador to the United States. Couldn't happen. Couldn't be a job that was more suited to his skills, I have to say. But Sir Keir is now in a lot of trouble. The donors who powered him into Downing Street have apparently got a bad case of buyer's remorse. The fake organisation that he sort of lent on to become Labour leader, Labour Together, is said to have become directionless, according to this report in the Times, which we're sharing with you now, and is losing staff and losing funding. So it would appear that even the people who backed Keir Starmer are now completely sick of Keir Starmer, they've worked out what all of us who had, a functioning brain knew a long time ago, which is that the man is a chronic weakling, um, a stiff buffoon who tries to act statesmanlike and tough, but comes across as even less convincing than the old Yes Minister series, when the Jim Hacker character would put his hand in his jacket and start talking like Churchill. At least Paul Eddington was a good actor. Keir Starmer is a porcine lard bucket of a man who, when he tries to act courageous, looks like he's about to simultaneously soil himself and burst into tears. So it's not a surprise that the British ruling class have worked out that he's not quite their sort of chap. So, Kit, where is this going now? Is this the night of the long knives for Sir Keir and the Starmerites?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very interesting because I think that I mean, people like you and I, for a very long time, including before Keir Starmer became leader, were sounding alarm about this group called Labour Together. It was extremely shadowy. It was set up by this individual called Morgan McSweeney, who was Keir Starmer's campaign manager and then was the quote-unquote mastermind of Labour's 2024 election campaign when they won purely because they weren't the government, and that was the overwhelming reason people voted for them. It wasn't because of their policies, because they had none. It wasn't because of Keir Starmer, because he's awful. And it was effectively this secret cabal within the party that set out to completely neutralize the left, and they were devastatingly successful at doing it. And there was a Guardian article published, I think it might have been last summer, that it was an excerpt from a book which documented how effectively McSweeney had said, well, the Labour right has a canary problem, in reference to the fact that the Canary, which was a very popular pro-Corbyn independent news website, was getting an enormous amount of hits and was establishing itself as a key source of information for left-wingers within the UK, and it was pushing people to vote for Jeremy Corbyn and debunking and countering mainstream smears of Corbyn. Now, as a result, McSweeney set up a shadowy, again, organisation called Stop Funding Fake News, which set out to neutralise the Canary and managed to shame advertisers from pulling all of their advertising from the site because they falsely claimed that the Canary promoted anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, that being, content critical of Israel and that was sympathetic towards the Palestinians. Now, I've spoken to people that I know who currently and previously worked at the Canary, and they were absolutely shocked to see this confirmed publicly. But this was just one strand of a wider effort to completely purge the Labour Party of any left-wing sentiment and Jeremy Corbyn's support base, and they were devastatingly successful. And they parachuted Keir Starmer first into the leadership based on lies, and then into Downing Street based on lies. But as you say, there now seems to be a significant amount of buyer's remorse because, as we have discussed before, Keir Starmer has the charisma of a block of wood. And even when he is making tub-thumping speeches, of which he has attempted to make many, they fall flat and indeed on completely deaf ears. Now, as we'll soon get into, Starmer, despite the US unambiguously telling the Europeans to back off the proxy war and let the adults in the room wind this down, he is determined to keep this going, and this is despite a self-initiated defence review into increasing increasing Britain's defence budget. That's been subject to harsh mainstream criticism, and Britain's own military chiefs say it goes nowhere near far enough. And I might add that this review has already seen a large amount of equipment and scrapped, and there are questions over whether Britain's completely useless aircraft carriers might be sold, or indeed, yes, turned into scrap metal in turn. Labour has pledged to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, hasn't offered a date for implementing this. Lammy, the worst foreign secretary in history, which is saying something, he has called for a trebling of defence spending. But I think, you know, this is as we've discussed before, the figures involved are actually absolutely irrelevant, because when you don't have a defence industrial base, or an industrial base at all, as Britain doesn't, you know, like actually, shockingly, a tiny island, neutral island, has a bigger manufacturing sector than Britain. Half of its economy is making things. The UK doesn't have that. You know, and it will take, if they were to undertake efforts to reindustrialize, it would take decades to recover what was lost. So all of these numbers being thrown around, you know, they don't equate to new soldiers, bullets, tanks, you know, fighter jets, naval vessels. So I mean, it's all effectively a dog and pony show, and what's the word? It's theatre. And I mean, I also think as well that I mean, we've discussed before about Trump laying traps for people. Trump has called for NATO members to raise their defense spending to 5% of GDP as a minimum. For many of these countries, in overall government spending terms, that would amount to like perhaps half of what they spend on everything annually, which is a completely insane objective, which no country in NATO is going to be able to meet seriously. And I think that yes, I mean, Keir Starmer, despite everything, authored this bombastic op-ed for the Telegraph, unnoticed by most people, again, because nobody pays any attention to anything Starmer says these days. And he was talking about how putting Britons in harm's way is a huge responsibility, but I'm ready to do it.
After you, Keir.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's just remarkable. But it's presumably written by one of his advisors, but credited to him for the Telegraph, which is, you know, this very jingoistic, very pro-Ukraine newspaper. He talks about how this is a once in a generation moment for Europe's collective security. Russia represents this existential threat to Europe. Britain stands poised to act as a bridge between the US and Europe. This, you know, directly echoes what Blair said before the Iraq War, you know, an offer that Europe wasn't interested in at the time. You know, I'm not quite sure that I'm not quite sure that they're going to be attracted to Keir's reheated offer of this. And you know, there's a funny moment, and there's a funny passage in this where Starmer states, you know, I believe the UK can play a unique role in ensuring peace in Ukraine, just as we did this past week in stepping in to convene and chair the Ukraine Defence Contact Group. Now, just for viewers who, for whatever crazy reason, have not did not catch our previous broadcast when we discussed this, when the way this is phrased suggests that, like, you know, that Britain, swaggering Britain, you know, like, stepped up to take responsibility for Europe's security. No, they were just, the US put them in charge of this. in the manner of the captain of the Titanic delegating someone else to be the captain so he can run away. Like, you know, it's I mean, or it's like someone becoming school milk monitor and thinking that they have some kind of power as a result. You know, it's a job that nobody else really wants, and you know, it's not somehow a plucky underdog British achievement that this has happened. They were following direct US orders. Now, in the next passage, Starmer states, "I'm heading to Paris with a very clear message for our European friends. We have got to show we are truly serious about our own defence and bearing our own burden." And then, you know, we fast forward to that meeting. And what happens? Scholl storms out of it because he thought that what Keir Starmer was proposing was completely insane. But not only that, there is there are a number of British military chiefs, both current and former, who have said, well, we don't actually have the means to maintain a peacekeeping operation in Ukraine, let alone one that could potentially escalate into conflict with Russian forces. You know, we don't have the soldiers, we don't have the equipment. I might add as well that I read recently that, and this escaped my attention at the time, in 2021 there was a British war game in which it simulated it was effectively a stress test to simulate Britain in a major conflict scenario, and it found out that Britain ran out of ammunition within 10 days. Now, you factor in the fact that since the start of the war in Ukraine, Britain has sent an enormous amount of that equipment that's already at perilously low levels to Ukraine without a means to replenish it. So they would last even less time in an actual conflict scenario now. And so yes, as Alex has up on the screen, this is a BBC report stating that Lord Dannatt, an ex-army chief, has said that you know, up to 40,000 British troops would be needed for a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, and we haven't got that number available.
No,
and this is, according to mainstream reports, some mainstream reports, that's at 40,000 is about as much as Russia is, or slightly more than Russia is recruiting monthly to its own military.
Well, Kit, just to break in for a moment,
sorry,
what if we asked the Russians to stop fighting when we ran out of bullets? Could we not
that's
say
fair.
that's fair? I mean, look, we've run out of bullets. Look, we know you've got more, but can we not have this on gentlemen's rules? Which is that you wouldn't shoot at a man who'd run out of bullets, would you? And then that answer would come quite swiftly afterwards, I think. But again, like, it just shows that this is the tactics of the British ruling class, or in actual fact, the strategy they've pursued for decades now has not involved them actually getting on the ground and fighting a serious war. They fight colonial policing operations. Like the Iraq War was the most direct conflict that they ever aimed to have. Like they hooted and like jumped up and down and screamed about Afghanistan. They were going to do it. They were going to take it over. That damn coward Biden was running away. What do they do? Nothing. This is the same. They will scream and shout. Starmer will jump up and down and say that he's prepared to do take the serious decisions or something like that. And what will happen? Nothing. They will say that they need to expand the military industrial production. What will happen? Nothing. Because fundamentally, to do all of this, it's not. I've made this argument many times before, but I will repeat it. You can't just suddenly say we must upscale military industrial production. Okay, well, what about the rest of the productive processes, the rest of the supply chain, the rest of the scientific and technological base you need to actually have a military industrial production base? Because Britain doesn't have that anymore. You don't have the we don't have the people. They don't have the enormous supply chains that would need to be set up. They don't have the primary industries in Britain that are used to extract and then manufacture the base components for a lot of this stuff. They're reliant upon supply chains that stretch all over the world, including to, of course, China, who is apparently a deadly enemy, but can make a large amount of technological components that go into British military equipment. So this is a complete fantasy. We're into the realm of like utter delusion. Like these people have no idea what they are doing. I think the generals like Dannett and others do have more of a clue because they at least have had to deal with some sort of real concrete realities at certain points in their careers. The likes of Lammy and the likes of John Healey and the likes of Keir Starmer and the likes of the man we're going to be featuring soon, a certain Wesley Streeting, have no clue. In fact, their entire career has been built on the sort of a completely sealed off, hermetically sealed up bubble where the real world problems are the fact that you don't have an industrial base and can't just magic one back into existence again have never intruded upon them because it's a world of think tanks and chairing meetings and having lunches with academics and pollsters who'll tell you that your bold leadership, Sir Keir, has increased your poll rating by almost 0.75% amongst the over 75s or something like that. And Keir will nod and his girdle will strain and then he'll have to be taken into the back and tightened up again. So this is all bottom of the barrel end stage imperialism stuff. Like at least with the US, they're in theory, they still have enough of a industrial, technological and scientific base where they could, if the federal government basically took it over, upscale their industrial production when it comes to the military side. No such thing exists here. Like Britain doesn't produce the major planes for its air force are co-produced. They were co-produced with European countries. Now they're going to be bought in from the US. I think the next British Army standard issue rifle is going to be something model that's produced in the US. The so-called nuclear deterrent is overwhelmingly dependent on components that comes from the US. It is a contentious argument, but the case has been made many times that the British Prime Minister might not even have the power to pull the trigger on the so-called independent nuclear deterrent, given how much of the system is dependent upon US components and US satellites to actually guide the fucking thing. British power, outside of like the money that is accumulated in the City of London, which does buy them a lot, it doesn't exist. It's basically like it's a simulation. It's to use the old Jean Baudrillard phrase, it's a simulacra of power. It is the illusion of it. There's nothing there now. And that's why Rubio or whoever wrote those questions for him knew what they were doing when they put those questions to the Europeans, because they know damn well that if the question is, what will you do? The answer is, we'll ask America. Yes. If America won't do it, then none of these clowns can do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I mean, on the subject of Trident as well, that like I mean, this is rather forgotten, but like there have been parliamentary parliamentary inquiries into into Trident, which have included expert evidence from people within the military and indeed the Britain's defence industry, which acknowledge that Trident is a quote unquote hostage to American goodwill and is retained to maintain the facade of Britain being a great power. Like they know themselves that this is a white elephant, which is and status symbol that, along with Britain's useless aircraft carriers, which they can pretend that so Britain can pretend that it is still this major global power and has a blue water navy. We've discussed before, there was last summer a very little noticed and not particularly reported on House of Lords investigation into lessons learned from the Ukraine war. And then, witness after witness, which included people like Nick Carter, who used to be the head of the British military, and was described by, he headed up the mission, the British mission in Afghanistan, and was slammed by his American counterparts as not the kind of person you'd put in charge of anything. But witness after witness said, Britain doesn't have a military. It can't afford to maintain these status symbols that it has spent so long chasing. And indeed, in a real war scenario, it would be absolutely screwed. But then again, their only prescription, aside from initiating airsoft clubs, which are where people can, average citizens can learn how to handle weapons, but with British Army training in an airsoft or paintball environment. Their only prescription for trying to correct this is spend money. And it's like, but again, like that doesn't translate very quickly or easily into anything tangible. And I think that, I mean, in terms of enduring delusions, it was not long ago that when there were cuts made to Britain's already minuscule kind of armed forces, Grant Shapps stated that will make up for this shortfall with a can-do attitude. And it's like, I mean, it's like, a similar. I might add that there has been a similar kind of delusional, magical thinking to a lot of the war planning in, as we have previously discussed, where, like, I mean, there have been mainstream reports acknowledging that when Kiev launched its ill-fated 2023 counteroffensive, which resulted in the loss of up to 100,000 people in return for regaining 0.25, a quarter of a percentage point of the land lost to Russia. The Western powers pushing Ukraine to do this knew they didn't have all the equipment they needed, but they thought that Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would win the day. Versus tanks.
Yeah. I've heard of self-ID, but I've never thought that self-identifying as being tank-proof or bulletproof would enable you to withstand heavy artillery fire. Though apparently there are some people in the British government who are of the belief that if you wish it, therefore it is. But that seems to be the governing philosophy of the entire British ruling class now. It's like, we must pretend we are a great power because if we stop pretending, then everybody will see that not only is the emperor naked, he's been dead since 1914. The stench is overpowering, shall we say. Now,
speaking of overpowering stenches.
Speaking of overpowering stenches, we turn to the stinking homunculus that is known as Wesley Streeting, a favourite of absolutely nobody. Well, maybe not nobody. He has some fans, apparently. There is a feeling within the Labour Party, and this is a feeling that seems to be escalating, that Keir Starmer is exactly what many of us always said that he was, which is literally a dead fish, with zero charisma, zero political skills, zero brains, and zero ability to pilot himself or his wretched party out of the cul-de-sac that they have steered themselves down. So, who do they turn to? Who do they bring back? Who do they elevate to the highest position in the land? Well, it is, of course, the thinking man's slimy bastard, a man who you wouldn't trust alone with, anybody, a man who looks as if he might enjoy, shall we say, certain products that to the common folk are illegal, but which I'm told that in the Palace of Westminster, in the House of Commons, are everywhere, including over most of the toilet surfaces. I will leave the viewers and the listeners to fill in all of the gaps in that sentence with their imaginations, and I have faith in all of you that you have imaginations powerful enough to understand what I'm driving at there. We are, of course, referring to Mr. Wesley Streeting and his limitless ambition. He is a man of limited brains, of limited courage, of limited intelligence, but of unlimited ambition. And really, that's all you need to become British Prime Minister these days. So the Mail Online ran a story a couple of days ago about how Streeting's allies have infiltrated government. Now, I think that what this actually is that all of Starmer's allies are abandoning him en masse and have now defected to Streeting. It's not that Streeting's got some secret army somewhere. It's that the network that backed Starmer has lost faith in him and is looking for somebody else to bring in. Streeting is positioning himself as the man for the job, but only if, of course, that the Labour Party membership doesn't actually get a vote. So that's what Streeting's plan is hinges on. No one actually being able to vote against him, which I've got to say, as a plan goes, that's pretty solid. I mean, you'd win if nobody was allowed to actually vote against you, because there are others who would fancy the job, possibly. There's again a slammy bastard who does a better job of being a passable human, which is Andrew Burnham, or Andy Burnham as he's known, the mayor of Greater Manchester. He's clearly interested in it, or has been in the past. There are a couple of others who might fancy a crack at it. Streeting is clearly the choice of those who are closest to, like, the City of London and the various other power centres. So he thinks he should get it. But Keir's time, I think he's going to be up soon. I think they'll let him have a year, and then he'll be told, Keir, it's time to step down for you to spend more time with that wife you don't live with. Allegedly. And check out the Twitter account named AUpLovely for more details on that one.
The indispensable AUpLovely. Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, the indispensable and very, very funny Mr. AUp, I think it has to be said. Anyway, it would seem that Keir Starmer is not long for this political world, and as he's been a good boy and has followed orders for 30 years from the British security state, I'm sure that when his handlers tap him on the shoulder and say, look, old boy, change of plan, it's not working, good job, don't worry, job in the House of Lords for you, and he'll say, oh yes, very good, and he'll do as he's told, and he'll quit, endorse Streeting on the way out, and then we'll get this wretched, shiny-faced piece of garbage twatting about on the world stage for a few years. But Kit, I throw to you for your analysis of this fucked up situation.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think it's just we have discussed our mutual and indeed fathomless contempt for Wes Streeting before. I mean, I do think it speaks to I mean, we've kind of reached the dregs of what's available, the backwash of the Labour Party in the wake of the left being gutted, neutralised, and subjugated. Streeting, I might add to your lurid description of him, he looks like a spitting image puppet of himself. Yeah. There is something very kind of rubbery and something just sinister, even when he smiles. Of course, he is the health secretary and has taken an enormous amount of bribes. I mean, sorry, contributions from the private healthcare sector. But I might add as well that. The fact that he is now being built up, I mean, and built up as a serious kind of replacement for Keir Starmer. It's just like the latest story about how, well, Starmer's for the chop, and it's like, we've had Trump's plotting against Starmer, Elon Musk wants to replace Starmer. And it's like, I mean, I strongly suspect, we've discussed this before, that those stories were an attempt to blame the failure of Starmer and his removal from the premiership on external forces. But also, I think it was testing the water to see how people would react. Enough people on social media said, based Trump. In response to these questions, that they think, oh well, actually, we can actually probably get away with removing Keir Starmer. Now, I might add that there is a Ian Dunt, who is this just
careful how you say his name.
Yes, it's Dunt, yes. And he, I might add that Ian Dunt was a very, 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 very key underminer and saboteur of the Corbyn project. He is one of those one of several centrist journalists who hailed Starmer's election as the second coming of Christ. And all of 2 weeks ago was talking about how, Starmer knows how to handle Trump. He's a very, very clever operator. He's dealt blah 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 blah. And then a week later, he suddenly wrote an op-ed for the I paper stating that his support for Starmer has begun to crumble. Hilariously,
I love a man of faith. I don't know about you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's it was. I think that the details were kind of quasi religious because
Mm.
what was quite remarkable is that he effectively in the I strongly suggest our viewers and listeners don't read this because it's absolute dirge. But he effectively done started out this column about how he had fallen out of love with Keir Starmer with this very lengthy fawning. Mini biography of Starmer, stating that he was a man who I believed stood for dignity in work, and talked about how Starmer had given free legal advice to prostitutes in the brothel above which he lived briefly. Which, I mean, I'm sure there's something more to the story. I'm sure there's something more to the story than that.
Yeah.
I'm sure that services may have been rendered in return. But anyway, it just goes on and on and on and on and on about how decent Keir Starmer is, and then he states, well, actually, the real tipping point for me is that Labour is going to pass legislation meaning that no refugee who enters Britain via, say, boats at Dover will ever be able to gain citizenship, and will be, an unwanted alien presence and probably subject to forced deportation somewhere. And I like. In describing this, Dunt, like even then, he was states that, well, tightening laws around immigration is around refugees is entirely fair, quote unquote, and using videos of raids and deportations to instill fear in potential refugees might be grim and vindictive, but is acceptable. So it's like there's like what he's saying is that the demonization of refugees and their persecution legally is perfectly acceptable in good politics to a point,
Mm.
but there's a limit. And Starmer's like past that limit. And I think that when Ian Dunt, who, yes, spoke of Starmer in the most unctuous, reverential terms about how, oh, the adults are back in charge, thank God. I think when you've lost his support, then that's pretty much game over. On the subject of fawning former allies of Starmer, who seem to talk less and less about their chosen savior with the passing of time, our old friend Agent Mason.
Oh, he has returned.
He has, well, he never really left, but people just stopped listening to him. I
Mm.
think, and I don't think that he'd been listened to for very long anyway. But I mean, he has taken a job with this think tank, which is called the Council on Geostrategy, which
Mm.
sounds ever so slightly sinister and Orwellian. He's on while Starmer was running for leadership. Mason made a famous, rather infamous quote where he said, "What was it about not understanding things from a Marxist
Oh, if you
perspective?"
don't understand the potential in Keir Starmer's pragmatic social democracy or whatever it was, then you're not analysing things in a proper Marxist way. To which I respond, Paul, if you ever want that discussion on the proper Marxist understanding of social democracy, either myself or any of my party comrades are available to have that discussion with
At
you
any time.
at any time. We'll have it here on the show. Kit can sit in judgment, as Kit, you are a man who knows Paul's inner secrets, and we're happy to debate you on the Marxist interpretation of social democracy. And I await your call. You know where to find us. I'm pretty sure that one of us featured on your Mind Palace, so do let us know. We await the call. I don't anticipate we'll be getting one. Now, we have, of course, been graced by a visit by Agent Mason to the airwaves recently, where he was seemingly taking care of some business that had been assigned to him by his handlers, which is, of course, talking up the increase in defence spending with a ludicrous new policy. So, Kit, shall we treat the good listeners and viewers to the works of Agent Mason, who's looking even more like a sort of version of Himmler, who's been on the Atkins diet recently?
Yeah,
So,
he does seem to have lost a lot of weight. I mean, presumably there is a portrait of him in an attic somewhere,
well,
becoming more principled as
even
time goes on.
yes, if you look at this sort of skinny version of Himmler here, but Himmler if he was from Lee. Right. So this is, if you're not aware of what this is called Sunday Morning. This is an unbearable show on Sky News presented by an unbearable Labour Party goon called Trevor Phillips, where it usually has a trio of utter wankers on it. So you have at least two wankers there. I'm not aware of who the woman is. If someone is able to fill us in on those details, do let me know. Unimportant at this stage because we're here for the Mason show. So here we go. Right. So I hope you all took that in. Paul says that taxes must go up. Call it the freedom tax because that'll be really popular. He's clearly a man with his finger on the pulse of the British working class, who are desperate for another form of taxation to suck out what little money they've got left in order to pay for probably the stock options of Paul, judging from his glowing report of the British military industrial complex there, which I presume comes from the same place that all of Paul's reports come from, which is his imagination. Because what he's talking about is simply a fantasy. Like, even like pre-reactionary like news sources and commentators have observed that like British defense production is like small scale workshop level stuff. It can't compete with like anything the Russians are doing, never mind what the Chinese are doing, or even what the Americans could do if they actually got there to put a serious plan in place. Like, this is nonsense that he's talking there. Like, it's very rare that like Trevor Phillips seems like the more realistic person in the room, but like, what the hell is Mason talking about, other than, of course, defending his own private interests, which I think is what it's really all about. The other thing I took from that clip is that even true believer Paul has given up on Ukraine. If you heard that, he says, oh, it's about more than Ukraine being forced into a disadvantageous peace. Well, Paul and his backers have clearly written off the Ukraine project. They've already moved on to the next grift, which is the fantasy that Russia's going to invade fucking Finland. But your response to our old friend, Kit?
Well, I mean, this clip caught my. It's completely unsurprising. I mean, given that not long ago he was saying that people who don't support the Royal Navy are fundamentally opposed to the working class. I guess that that they're just not understanding gunboat diplomacy and maritime imperialism from a Marxist perspective. But I mean, it just we know for a fact, based on my past reporting, that he is directly fed talking points by his friends in British intelligence. I am absolutely certain that he is now getting talking points from his sponsors in BAE. He has, as we mentioned, taken up a role with this Council on Geostrategy. If you look at their funders, it is like every single defense. Every single defense contractor under the sun, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, the Royal Navy, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the BAE Systems, BP, pretty much like every organization and government department in the West that stands to make a killing, literally, off vastly increased defense spending. Yes, it's entirely unsurprising. But again, what he is proposing is total fantasy. I mean, Paul is no stranger to that. But I might add as well that one of the things that really jumped out to me, and you had it on screen not long ago, is that the Council of Geostrategy has this Substack that's called Britain's World, which is, I mean, it sounds rather ominous, and it does tend to suggest that the people running this think tank and the people working for it, like Paul Mason, genuinely think that the world is still run by the British, or that this is something in the offing. This was rather missed at the time. It didn't get any mainstream traction, but they posed the purely hypothetical question of whether the UK needed a new information research department. Now, for listeners unfamiliar with IRD, I have done some work on this. My friend John McAvoy at Declassified UK has done some extraordinary digging into the the declassified file trail on IRD. Effectively, in brief, IRD was this Cold War era black propaganda unit that was run by the security and intelligence services, and it was about countering domestic threats from the left at home with propaganda campaigns, setting up fake radical magazines in order to attract particular audiences and seed imperialist messaging under this veil of radical rhetoric, and it was engaged in similar skullduggery abroad. In some cases, it was involved in coups. In Indonesia, they assisted Suharto seizing power in the 1950s was it the 1960s? They spread false stories of massacres by communist insurgents in Indonesia, which the Indonesian army used as a pretext for carrying out very real massacres of vast swaths of the population in one of the biggest bloodbaths in post-World War II history. And the declassified Foreign Office records related to these operations show that the officials involved were laughing and joking about the impact that their propaganda was having. The question to any person with a ounce of morality or ethics, the question of whether the British government needs a new IRD should be a resounding no. But also it's an irrelevant question because Britain has, ever since IRD was formally shut down in the late 70s, had numerous and still has numerous departments that copy its work. So there's the Research, Information and Communications Unit, which is directly modelled on IRD. It's heavily involved in Prevent. You then have Integrity Initiative, which likewise was a black propaganda unit staffed by British intelligence veterans that fed fake information about China and Russia into the media in order to demonize these countries and lay the foundations for war. And then most strikingly, in Paul Mason's leaked conversations with his British intelligence handler, Andy Price, which we at the Grey Zone exposed in the summer of 2022, Mason and Price discuss the creation of something called the International Information Brigade. Now, Alex, I know that you have some very strong feelings about this particular phraseology.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I will just ask you to pause there for a moment because I want to just tackle this. Paul Mason, you may be aware, good viewers and listeners, is what I would call a long-time Trotskyite twat. And having been a Trotskyite myself, maybe some of you out there were as well. Look, it's okay as long as you get over it and move on. Paul has never moved on, and I would argue he has, whether directly employed or been directly employed or otherwise, he has been a long-term asset of the British state for his entire miserable career. To steal the name of the international brigades, like this is a misappropriation of British communist history, because the international brigades were organized via the Communist International. The bulk of the men who went and fought in them, or at least a great number of them, were working class men who were members of the Communist Party of Great Britain when that actually meant something. When the people who ran the Information Research Department and their immediate predecessors were monitoring them round the clock and arresting them, harassing them, trying to undermine the Communist Party at every single turn. Had Paul been around in the 1930s when the Communist Party of Great Britain was recruiting for the international brigades to go and fight in Spain, he'd have been denouncing them. He'd have been denouncing them as Stalinists. And let's just also say, well, where did Paul's political lineage come from? Well, it came from people who were assets of Francoism. I'm not joking. The Trotskyite movement and in Spain in the 1930s through the POUM, Partido Oberonce Unida Marxista, Party of United Marxism, they were uncovered shortly after the end of the war as having covert relationships with the Francoists to actually stage false flag operations, disruption operations, carry out uprisings behind the Republican lines in Barcelona to disrupt the front line on the pretext of the fact that the Communist Party of Spain was secretly running things on behalf of Stalin. Now, if that sounds like a British operation, well, maybe it was, because British intelligence asset, a certain Eric Blair, real name, well, codename George Orwell, was in the POUM. He was sent there by the Independent Labour Party. So Orwell himself, of course, was not an international brigader. So it's entirely fitting in some ways that Mason would try to wear the skin of a genuine working class movement, because that's what his entire career is based on. Stealing from honourable communists of the past and trying to appropriate it, despite the fact that his politics are the exact opposite of that. And he stands in a direct lineage from people who were British intelligence assets and fascist collaborators. So fuck them both. Shall we continue?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that just on the subject of absolutely repulsive appropriation of revolutionary terminology and concepts, you know, at the Grey Zone, we have reported on numerous leaks that show that the British have been involved in creating stay behind quote unquote partisan units in Ukraine to carry out sabotage, assassinations and other skullduggery. You know, blowing up Russian railway lines and other incendiary acts in Russian territory, and they have been framed in the media as partisans, therefore invoking the spirit of the very brave men and women in Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union who, facing total annihilation, took up arms and fought off their oppressors very successfully, therefore liberating themselves. And these, in most cases, ultra-nationalist neo-Nazis that the British have been dallying with for a very long time in Ukraine are being built up as this anti-fascist resistance. So, but I mean, it makes my blood boil too. And I think that what's really interesting is that in some of these leaked this leaked correspondence between Mason and his British intelligence handler, they talk about the prospect of setting up this IIB that would effectively receive a steady flow of intelligence, would be in an intelligence clearinghouse like IRD for black propaganda that could be used to influence media coverage and maybe influence government policy, quote unquote, perhaps through cutouts. Mason recognised that that people aren't stupid and that this needs to look like a grassroots operation. Otherwise, the quote-unquote opposition, which according to Paul Mason's insane target map includes the black community,
all of them,
and all of them, to a man and woman. He states that they're not stupid and they can spot an info op. So the more this is designed to be organic, the better. So it is rather eerie that we fast forward to today and this very, very, very dubious organisation for which Paul Mason now works, his time in British journalism having come to a precipitous end. If I personally played any role in that, I see that as a career achievement. It's interesting that they are proposing exactly what he was discussing 2.5 years ago with his friend in the Foreign Office. I mean, Mason is, of course, is not the only asset in the mainstream media who has been all in on Ukraine. But I mean, contrary to Mason's apparent loss of interest in Ukraine, a certain George Monbiot, a committed environmentalist and Syrian dirty war propagandist, has a lot to say about what negotiating a settlement with Russia would amount to.
Yes, he does indeed. And I should hasten to add that this clip came up on Twitter. I very rarely, if at all, watch Question Time. It is a repulsive program filled with what I can only describe as a human zoo of British establishment figures, which would be better off being tossed into the Thames. But this came up and it reminded me of the fact that this is the voice of the British left speaking here. I will play it for you and allow you to draw your own judgments, good listeners, as to why that is. Here we go. Mm. Oh, please do, Right, the fact that he still gets applause for those lines 3 years into this shit just shows who they have in the fucking audience for this thing. My God. I'll just start off by saying, like, look, he is absolutely representative of the British left. I know this upset some people on Twitter when I said that, but face facts, guys. He is like this guy has a lot of influence, just as Mason did until, of course, Kit and the Grey Zone's timely intervention. But Monbiot has been a big influential voice on the British left, both in the left of the Labour Party, in the Green Party, and in various Trotskyite organizations for a long time. And his talking points there are straight out of MI6. That's straight out of, that's not even out of like American agencies. That's straight from the shady think tank world of Westminster. And think about what he's saying there. What he's saying there is a direct talking point straight from the security state. When what did he say when Goodwin challenged him? He says, "Okay, well, we'll just keep the war going." Because that's the perspective that Keir Starmer is putting forward. Keep the war going at all costs. So that's the great environmentalist, who, by the way, isn't that great. Obviously, isn't much of an environmentalist, given how much pollution, not to mention like, large amounts of death that this war has produced. Because what George's agenda really is first of all following whatever orders he's getting from the people who hand him the envelope before his public appearances, but also his agenda as a intellectual of British social democracy, which is what he is to find ways to ideologically do the laundering of the establishment talking points that are there to justify the attempts to revive British imperialism. That's what George's job is, and he's out there doing that when he's giving it all this belligerent nonsense. But what my final point on this is, like, what are these things he's talking about? What is this democratic world order? Because that's something that comes straight out of like a Hillary Clinton or a Barack Obama or a Joe Biden speech. The democratic world order, what it is beyond the pale to invade sovereign countries and occupy them. Where was George 20 years ago? Because I remember him being a public figure 20 years ago, and he was big into opposing the Iraq war. So in theory, then, according to George's own standards, the US and Britain are outside of the democratic world order because they invaded a sovereign country in the form of Iraq, in fact, several sovereign countries, destroyed it, asset stripped it, and turned it into a hellhole. And so, in theory, it should have been the US and the British far long before the Russians, who were expelled from the civilized society. But George seems to have forgotten all of that and has gone into this ridiculous. Of course, he has to bring up the fucking Chamberlain in World War II analogy. And again, I will confine myself just simply to saying this: old Neville Chamberlain was doing what his class demanded. And his class demanded a tacit alliance with the Nazis to crush the Soviet Union. But given that George is a rabid anti-communist and probably doesn't even know that fact, he just has this fucking cartoon Marvel Comics view of British history, where plucky Churchill waved his sword at Hitler, and then 4 years later it was D-Day and everybody was having tea in Berlin. You know, the actual reality of World War II is lost on clowns like this. But I have ranted for long enough. I will give you the floor, sir.
I mean, again, it's difficult to know where to start with George Monbiot, and I might add that, like, he was during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, at least initially, he did distinguish himself by writing very critical op-eds for the Guardian or the Observer, whatever they were the one and the same until recently, in effect. In which he, yes, was very critical and did some rare digging into the wider kind of geopolitical and energy interest driving all this. But he was always very careful to say, but it's not just about oil. You know, that like actually there is a humanitarian aspect, there is a security aspect to it, but there is this. Also, coincidentally, there is a separate agenda which these interventions are serving. And yes, as I say, he became this tub thumping advocate for direct intervention into Syria. Excuse me, and was viciously came after academics, dissident journalists and activists who were opposed to this, and like, you know, really, really nastily in public, and wrote numerous op-eds about how anyone anyone who isn't for all-out invasion of Syria is an Assadist and supports the gassing of innocent people. His line about oh well, this is like Putin being given Kent by Trump has been echoed by other people in the media, including the god-awful Julia Hartley-Brewer, who made this exact point. And I think that this is another. I mean, you mentioned about the distortion of the historic record. I think what's important to note is that actually, people have war hawks and war propagandists like George have been very quick to invoke appeasement as a reason for military action all over the world, Western military action all over the world, and attempting to shame people into consenting to this. The reality of and I actually have an article coming on this, that the reality of quote unquote appeasement is very, 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 very different to the established narrative of what happened. So, in brief, the received establishment version of appeasement was Britain made some well-intentioned and popular, if ultimately foolhardy and catastrophic, concessions to Hitler, and then turned a blind eye to the Nazis brazenly breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles and militarily occupying the Rhineland and building an air force and blah, blah, blah. The reality was that appeasement involved direct collaboration particularly between German and British industry. But also there were significant talks at a very high level between the ruling elites of Britain and Germany about global political and economic partnership. The only problem, and I as I say, that in my forthcoming article, I go over some of the writings of Herbert von Dirksen, who was the last German ambassador to Britain before the World War II, which contains some absolutely remarkable disclosures. Very few people know about his writings, but they are rife with stunning passages where it was very, very clear that Britain was on board with what Hitler spelled out in Mein Kampf, which was a Europe dominated by Germany and the seas continuing to be dominated by the British, and some kind of international power sharing agreement between the two. The only difference was Britain wanted to do this gradually, but Hitler was in a hurry. And I'm sure that this was a sentiment shared by a lot of many people, both within the German and British elites, was that the war was actually, from their perspective, completely avoidable. If only Hitler had been slightly more patient, the British would have given him everything that he wanted, in return for propping up their flagging empire. So if we are to talk about negotiating with Russia being similar to appeasement, a negotiated settlement wouldn't include granting Putin complete control over Europe, or would it? It is a completely false analogy to draw, and I think that in every single conflict in history, including World War II, which ended with quote unquote unconditional surrender by Germany and Japan, there were actually conditions attached, and there were negotiations about the shape of their surrenders. So it's complete and utter nonsense. And I think yes, when you bear in mind that the territory that's currently being fought over is historically Russian, populated overwhelmingly by Russian speakers, and indeed by people who refuse offers of evacuation from Ukrainian authorities because they're waiting for the Russians to get there. It is a completely bogus analogy, but it's precisely the kind of thing that some pathetic propagandists like Monbiot would come out with.
Well, yes, exactly. And we're coming up to the hour, so we're probably going to have to draw things to a close for today.
Yes.
Shall we conclude with Nick Watt crying? Because I think that's probably a good place to end on. What about you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think yes. There's yeah, more to dig into in due course. Next week, every Wednesday, will a decline and fall shall return. But I think this kind of sums up. I think this clip, and it might mark the first time that bastards has been stated. The word bastards has been stated on Newsnight. I think this sums up the kind of the bewilderment within Western, particularly British elites, at the fact that the US aren't going to keep this going,
Hmm.
and
Okay.
on their behalf. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, this is Nick Watts, who's an annoying idiot who's been hanging around Newsnight for years, which, by the way, nobody watches Newsnight anymore.
No.
I'd like literally nobody. So he's talking to essentially an empty room. But here we go. BBC establishment figure weeping. I think this is a good way to close out the program for today. Well, there you go. The bafflement of British elite so-called journalists when faced with the fact that the imperial hegemon has new priorities now and doesn't include their pet project anymore. My final word on that would be that, well, of course it's over Zelensky's head. The entire last 4 years have been over Zelensky's head. His entire presidency has not been his. Like he has only ever been a puppet. The Brits like to pretend that their pet Ukrainian is some sort of great leader, when in reality they know very well he's some sort of drug-addled maniac who has to keep himself like high literally all day to avoid the gnawing, horrible reality that there's many people in Ukraine who would do him up like Mussolini. But finally, words to you, Kit.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I nothing to disagree with that. I just think the drama in his voice is just so funny because I think that speaks to his own personal disgust with this. And it's just like his own personal outrage, and it's like, yes, how dare the Americans not help us maintain our fantasies of being global power? The bastards are going to negotiate peace. How dare they? And it's like, yeah, I mean, if you want a perfect manifestation of enduring British delusion, European delusion about the extent of their own powers, and indeed the US's casual contempt for its quote unquote friends and allies, you would be hard pressed to find a better example. But yes, let's leave it there. Lots to pick up on next week. We hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and catch you next week, boys and girls.
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We'll be back again with you very soon. Until then, do continue to enjoy the decline and fall of the Anglo-American Empire. We'll be back with you next Wednesday.
Take care. Bye bye.
Cheers.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We have to change the way, the boy said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
전체의 사회주의를 우리 어떻게 정대로 지키는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님 백승의 영도 따라서 전군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조체의 강성애국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 세계여보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어